The sweltering heat of Washington, D.C. in July 1943 pressed against the windows of the Naval Annex, but inside room 2646, Lieutenant Junior Grade Elizabeth Smith Friedman felt only the cold grip of impossible choice. Before her, decoded fragments of German naval communications sprawled across her desk, intercepts that should not have reached her station, messages she had no authorization to process, intelligence that could save 12,000 American lives or end her career in disgrace. The clock on the wall read 0347 hours. In approximately 9 hours, convoy GUS-7A would depart Norfolk Naval Base, bound for North Africa, with 12,000 soldiers, medical personnel, and crucial supplies destined for the Mediterranean theater. The young men boarding those transports had no idea that beneath the Atlantic's dark waters, 3 German U-boats, U-527, U-359, and U-760, were converging on their exact route, positioned with surgical precision that suggested enemy intelligence had penetrated Allied convoy scheduling. Friedman's hands trembled slightly as she held the decoded message. The German transmission, sent from Admiral Karl Dönitz's headquarters in Lorient, France, contained grid coordinates that corresponded perfectly with the convoy's planned route. But this intelligence had not come through official Navy channels. She had intercepted it while monitoring South American spy networks, her actual assignment. The message had been routed through a Buenos Aires relay station she had been tracking for months, part of a Nazi espionage network she had spent years dismantling. Technically, she had no authority to be reading German naval communications. That was the responsibility of Ltjg, the Navy's official cryptanalysis division, a department that had made it abundantly clear that women, regardless of their expertise, were not welcome in matters of naval warfare intelligence. The protocols were explicit. Intelligence gathered outside official channels required verification, review, committee assessment, and chain of command approval before any action could be taken. That process typically required 48 to 72 hours. The convoy would be at sea in the kill zone, long before official machinery processed her warning. She could follow procedure and watch 12,000 men sail into an ambush, or she could violate direct orders and send an unauthorized warning directly to Norfolk Naval Base. This was not the first time. Elizabeth Friedman had faced institutional barriers that placed bureaucratic protocol above human lives. For nearly 2 decades, she had operated in the shadows of American intelligence, building systems of cryptanalysis that formed the backbone of counter-espionage operations, while watching men take credit for her innovations. She had broken codes that traditional codebreakers insisted were unbreakable. She had dismantled spy networks that threatened hemispheric security, while navigating a system designed to exclude her. She had become, by any objective measure, America's most effective counterintelligence operative, and yet her name appeared in no official records, her accomplishments attributed to nameless teams or male supervisors who barely understood the work she performed. But this decision carried different stakes. This was not about recognition or credit. This was not about fighting for her place in a male-dominated field. This was about 12,000 lives balanced against her career, her freedom, and potentially her husband's position as director of the Army's Signal Intelligence Service. William Friedman had built the foundation of American military cryptography, but his wife's insubordination could destroy everything they had worked to create. The Navy was looking for reasons to purge women from intelligence work. One unauthorized action, one violation of protocol, and she would provide them with the justification they needed. Friedman stood, walked to the window, and looked out over the darkened Capitol. Somewhere in those streets, in the halls of the Pentagon and the offices of naval intelligence, men were making decisions about strategy, about resources, about acceptable losses. They were not concerned with the individual soldiers, the young men from farms in Iowa and factories in Detroit, the boys who had never seen the ocean before they enlisted. Those men were statistics, acceptable casualties in the mathematics of global warfare. But Elizabeth Friedman had never been able to view human lives as abstractions. Every code she broke, every spy network she dismantled, every warning she issued carried the weight of individual existence. Husbands and fathers, sons and brothers, human beings whose lives hung in the balance of her decisions. She returned to her desk and began drafting the warning. Her career would likely end with this transmission. The Navy would convene a board of inquiry. There would be accusations of insubordination, questions about how she obtained the intelligence, implications that she had exceeded her authority. William would try to protect her, but even his influence had limits. The cryptography community would whisper about the woman who could not follow orders, who let emotion override discipline. Everything she had built, every barrier she had broken, would be reduced to this single act of defiance. But 12,000 men would live. At a 2 hours, Lieutenant Junior Grade Elizabeth Smith Friedman transmitted an unauthorized priority alert to Norfolk Naval Base, warning of enemy submarine presence along the planned route of convoy Goose 7A. She included the decoded German communications, the grid coordinates, and her assessment of the threat level. She did not identify herself. She did not explain how she had obtained the intelligence. She simply provided the information necessary to save lives and then sat back in her chair, knowing that the machinery of military justice would soon turn its attention toward her. The convoy route was altered. 12,000 men reached North Africa safely. 3 German U-boats waited in empty ocean for targets that never arrived, and the career of America's greatest cryptanalyst entered its final, most difficult phase. But to understand how Elizabeth Friedman arrived at that moment, to comprehend the full weight of her decision and the decades of struggle that preceded it, we must travel back to a very different time, to a young woman in rural Indiana who could not have imagined that her love of language and pattern would one day place her at the center of a secret war that would shape the destiny of nations. If you find this story as compelling as we do, please consider subscribing to our channel and sharing this video. The untold stories of history's forbidden heroes deserve to be heard, and your support ensures we can continue bringing these remarkable accounts to light. The genesis of a codebreaker, from Quaker College to Riverbank Laboratories, Elizabeth Smith, was born on August 26, 1892, in Huntington, Indiana, into a world that offered women narrow paths and limited horizons. Her father, John Marion Smith, was a prosperous banker and a pillar of the community, a man of rigid Victorian principles who believed that a woman's education should prepare her for exactly 2 roles, wife and mother. Her mother, Sophia Strock Smith, had once harbored intellectual ambitions, but had learned to subordinate such impractical dreams to the practical realities of domestic life. They raised 9 children in a household where proper behavior, religious devotion, and social conformity were valued far above individual aspiration. From her earliest years, Elizabeth demonstrated an unsettling tendency toward curiosity and independence. While her sisters learned needlework and social graces, Elizabeth buried herself in her father's library, devouring books on subjects considered wholly inappropriate for young women: history, political science, classical literature, and languages. She possessed what her teachers called an unusual aptitude for pattern recognition, able to memorize complex verse after a single reading, and identify subtle variations in grammatical structure that others overlooked. These talents were viewed not as gifts to be cultivated, but as eccentricities to be corrected, potential obstacles to making a suitable marriage. When Elizabeth expressed her desire to attend college, her father reluctantly agreed, but with conditions. She would attend Hillsdale College in Michigan, a small Quaker institution known for its conservative values and emphasis on moral education. She would study subjects appropriate for a woman, literature perhaps, or languages that might make her a more cultured conversationalist. And she would abandon these academic pursuits the moment a suitable man proposed marriage. Education, in John Marion Smith's view, was not meant to provide women with careers or independence. It was merely a finishing process, a way to make daughters more attractive to prospective husbands of good family and stable income. Hillsdale College in 1910 was a small world of strict regulations and carefully monitored social interactions. Female students lived under perpetual supervision, their movements restricted, their reading material censored, their futures predetermined. But within those constraints, Elizabeth Smith found unexpected freedom. She excelled in her language studies, mastering Latin and German with an ease that astonished her professors. She demonstrated an almost supernatural ability to see patterns in linguistic structure, to understand not just individual words, but the underlying systems that governed their arrangement and meaning. Professor Theodore Peckham, chair of the Languages Department, recognized something remarkable in this young woman from Indiana, a mind capable of analytical rigor that transcended the limitations of her era's expectations. Peckham encouraged Elizabeth to pursue graduate study, an almost unthinkable suggestion for a woman of her generation. Graduate education for women was rare. Professional opportunities for female scholars essentially non-existent. What would be the point of advanced degrees when no university would hire a female professor, when society expected educated women to abandon their studies the moment they married? But Elizabeth had begun to glimpse a different possibility, a life defined not by duty and conformity, but by intellectual challenge and personal achievement. She graduated from Hillsdale in 1915 with degrees in English literature and German, equipped with credentials that society insisted were essentially worthless for a woman, yet armed with capabilities that would soon prove invaluable to a nation heading toward global conflict. The summer of 1916 found Elizabeth Smith unemployed, living with her parents, and facing the suffocating prospect of permanent dependence. Her education had made her unsuitable for traditional women's work, but her gender made her unsuitable for intellectual employment. She had applied for teaching positions at universities throughout the Midwest and had received polite rejections that barely concealed the truth institutions of higher learning did not hire women for faculty positions, regardless of qualifications. She had inquired about library positions, translation work, editorial roles at publishing houses, and had been turned away at every opportunity. The world had no place for an educated woman who refused to accept the limitations of her gender. In June 1916, desperate for any employment that might utilize her education, Elizabeth traveled to Chicago to visit the Newberry Library, a research institution known for its extensive collection of rare books and manuscripts. She hoped to find work as a cataloger or translator, anything that would allow her to use her linguistic skills and escape the increasing pressure from her family to accept her situation and begin seeking a husband. While waiting in the library's reading room, she happened to meet a librarian who mentioned an unusual employment opportunity at a private estate called Riverbank Laboratories in Geneva, Illinois. The estate's owner, a wealthy textile merchant named George Fabian, had developed an obsession with the theory that Francis Bacon had written the works attributed to William Shakespeare, and that proof of this authorship could be found through cryptographic analysis of the first folio. Fabian had assembled what he called a department of ciphers, hiring researchers to search for hidden codes in Shakespeare's texts. He was currently seeking someone with expertise in Elizabethan literature and languages to join this peculiar research project. The work would be unconventional, the theories underlying the research likely absurd, but the position offered a salary, intellectual engagement, and escape from Huntington. Indiana Elizabeth Smith arrived at Riverbank Laboratories in late June 1916 and found herself in a world unlike anything she had imagined. George Fabian had transformed his 400-acre estate into a private research complex, complete with laboratories, libraries, a working farm, and residential facilities for researchers. He was a man of enormous wealth, boundless enthusiasm, and questionable judgment, a self-styled patron of science who believed that unlimited funding could solve any problem, prove any theory, and uncover any hidden truth. His department of ciphers was housed in a converted windmill, where researchers pored over photostats of Shakespearean texts, searching for codes that almost certainly did not exist. The head of the Department of Ciphers was a man named William Friedman, who had arrived at Riverbank 2 years earlier with a degree in genetics from Cornell University. Fabian had hired him to work on agricultural research, but had soon redirected him toward cryptographic studies, believing that Friedman's scientific training would bring analytical rigor to the search for Baconian ciphers. Friedman, a brilliant and methodical thinker, had quickly recognized that Fabian's theories about Shakespeare and Bacon were nonsense. But he had also recognized that cryptography itself, the science of codes and ciphers, represented an almost entirely unexplored field with profound practical applications. When Elizabeth Smith met William Friedman in the converted windmill at Riverbank, She encountered a man who shared her intellectual hunger and her frustration with a world that failed to recognize the value of systematic analysis and rigorous methodology. Friedman had been teaching himself cryptography through trial and error, developing systems of analysis that had no formal names because the academic field barely existed. He had been working alone, hampered by his isolation from any broader scientific community. And he recognized in Elizabeth Smith not just a skilled linguist, but a partner capable of understanding the work at its deepest levels. Their collaboration began with the absurd task of searching for Baconian ciphers in Shakespeare, but it quickly evolved into something far more significant. Together, they began to develop systematic approaches to cryptanalysis, creating methodologies for breaking codes that had never been formally articulated. Elizabeth brought her linguistic expertise and her intuitive understanding of pattern and structure. William contributed his scientific training and his insistence on reproducible methodology. They worked 12, 14, 16 hours a day, driven by the excitement of exploring genuinely new intellectual territory. As their professional partnership deepened, so did their personal relationship. They married on May 21, 1917, in a small ceremony at Riverbank, with George Fabian serving as witness. They honeymooned for exactly 3 days before returning to work, both aware that their studies had implications far beyond academic interest. The United States had entered World War I in April 1917, and suddenly, the obscure field of cryptography had become desperately important to national security. The Army and Navy had virtually no expertise in signals intelligence, no trained cryptanalysts, no systematic approach to breaking enemy codes. Riverbank Laboratories, with its 2 self-taught codebreakers, represented the closest thing America had to a cryptography department. Over the next 18 months, William and Elizabeth Friedman transformed themselves from researchers into codebreakers, handling increasingly sensitive materials for military and intelligence agencies. They developed training programs for Army and Navy personnel, teaching courses in cryptanalysis that formed the foundation of American signals intelligence. They broke codes that traditional intelligence officers had deemed unbreakable. They published the first systematic texts on cryptography in the English language, works that remained classified for decades because they were considered too advanced to share with potential adversaries. But even as they worked in genuine partnership, even as Elizabeth's contributions equaled or exceeded her husband's, the system began to assert its discriminatory logic. Military and intelligence officials praised Mr. Friedman's work, barely acknowledging that much of the analysis had been performed by his wife. When academic institutions and government agencies sought to hire trained cryptographers, they approached William, not Elizabeth. When articles about Riverbank's contributions appeared in newspapers and journals, they featured photographs of George Fabian and William Friedman, relegating Elizabeth to background mentions or omitting her entirely. The pattern that would define her career had already begun. Her work was essential. Her contributions recognized by those who worked directly with her, but credit flowed automatically toward men. The end of World War I in November 1918 brought sudden unemployment. Military contracts ended, government funding evaporated, and George Fabian lost interest in maintaining expensive research programs that no longer attracted attention or prestige. The Department of Ciphers disbanded. William Friedman was immediately offered a position with the Army, heading a new cryptography unit within the Signal Corps. Elizabeth Friedman received no offers. Despite identical experience and equivalent expertise, the message was clear: the military valued codebreakers, but it would not employ female cryptanalysts in official capacities. For several years, Elizabeth worked intermittently on contract, handling overflow projects that the Army's small cryptography unit could not process, always temporarily employed, always peripheral to official operations. She performed the same work as male analysts, but received no title, no security clearance, no recognition. This marginalization might have ended her career before it truly began. But in 1926, an unexpected opportunity emerged from the chaos of prohibition enforcement. The Prohibition War's cryptography against bootleggers. The 18th Amendment to the United States Constitution, ratified in 1919 and enforced beginning in 1920, prohibited the manufacture, sale, and transportation of alcoholic beverages throughout the nation. This grand social experiment, intended to eliminate the moral corruption associated with alcohol consumption, instead created one of the most extensive criminal enterprises in American history. Bootleggers, rum runners, and organized crime syndicates generated billions of dollars, moving illegal alcohol from Canada, Mexico, and the Caribbean into the United States, corrupting law enforcement at every level and creating violence that transformed American cities into war zones. By 1926, the Coast Guard and Treasury Department faced a fundamental problem. The criminal networks moving alcohol had become sophisticated operations, employing modern technology and professional organization. Rum-running ships used encrypted radio communications to coordinate movements, avoid Coast Guard patrols, and alert each other to enforcement activities. Shore-based coordinators employed coded telegrams to direct distribution networks spanning multiple states. The messages were often simple substitution ciphers or basic transposition codes, not particularly sophisticated by cryptographic standards, but they were opaque to Coast Guard officers and Treasury agents who had no training in code breaking. Treasury Department officials, searching desperately for someone who could break bootlegger codes, remembered the cryptography work performed at Riverbank Laboratories during the war. They contacted William Friedman, who was now firmly established as the Army's chief cryptographer, but he declined to take on outside work that might conflict with his military duties. He suggested, however, that his wife possessed identical expertise and considerably more free time, given that the Army refused to employ her. In May 1926, Elizabeth Friedman became an unpaid consultant to the Coast Guard, analyzing intercepted radio messages from rum-running operations. The work was supposed to be temporary, a few weeks of contract analysis to help the Coast Guard break up a single smuggling network operating in the Gulf of Mexico. But Elizabeth Friedman quickly discovered that she had walked into a war far more complex and extensive than anyone in the government had recognized. The rum-running networks were not isolated operations, but rather interconnected systems spanning the Caribbean, Central America, and South America, with connections to organized crime syndicates in major American cities. The coded messages she intercepted revealed an infrastructure of corruption, violence, and international coordination that threatened not just prohibition enforcement, but American security more broadly. Within months, Elizabeth Friedman had transitioned from consultant to the Treasury Department's primary cryptanalyst, handling every significant coded communication intercepted by Coast Guard and customs operations. She worked from a small office in Washington, with no staff, no budget, and no official title, processing hundreds of intercepted messages monthly. She identified patterns in criminal communications, mapped smuggling networks, and provided intelligence that led to major arrests and seizures. The work was tedious, often frustrating, and always undervalued. She received minimal payment, no recognition, and regular reminders that she was doing support work rather than real analysis. But this marginalized position also provided unexpected freedom. Because Elizabeth Friedman had no official status, no formal title, no place in the bureaucratic hierarchy, she was largely unsupervised. She could follow investigations wherever they led, pursue patterns that interested her, and develop her own methodologies without interference from superiors who might have limited her work to narrow, officially sanctioned channels. She began to notice elements in the intercepted communications that troubled her, references to South American contacts that seemed unrelated to alcohol smuggling, coded language that suggested political rather than criminal motivations, patterns of communication that resembled intelligence operations rather than commercial trafficking. In 1931, Elizabeth Friedman's investigations led her to a discovery that would transform her career and reveal a threat far more dangerous than rum running. Among the coded messages she was breaking, she found references to Nazi agents operating in South America, using smuggling networks as cover for intelligence gathering and political organization. This was 5 years before the Spanish Civil War, 8 years before the invasion of Poland, a time when most Americans viewed the Nazi Party as a marginal political movement in a distant country. But Elizabeth Friedman had stumbled onto evidence that German intelligence was already building networks throughout the Western Hemisphere, preparing infrastructure for a conflict that most people could not yet imagine. She compiled her findings and submitted them to her Coast Guard contacts, expecting that this intelligence would be forwarded to appropriate agencies, perhaps the State Department, or military intelligence, or the Bureau of Investigation, predecessor to the FBI. Instead, her report was filed away, dismissed as speculation beyond the scope of prohibition enforcement. Coast Guard officials wanted her to break codes related to alcohol smuggling, not chase conspiracy theories about foreign agents. Her warnings were ignored, her analysis shelved, her concerns treated as the overactive imagination of a woman who had exceeded her limited mandate. Elizabeth Friedman could have accepted this dismissal, could have returned to the narrow work expected of her, breaking bootlegger codes and staying within the boundaries of her marginal position. Instead, she made a decision that would define the next 15 years of her career. She would continue her investigations, would track the Nazi network she had discovered, would build the case methodically and irrefutably, even if she had to do it alone, even if the work was unpaid, even if no one wanted to hear what she had learned. She had glimpsed a threat to American security, and she could not ignore it simply because institutional inertia found it inconvenient. The shadow war Nazi networks in the Americas. Throughout the 1930s, while most Americans focused on Depression-era economic struggles, and most policymakers maintained strict neutrality regarding European political developments, Elizabeth Friedman waged a solitary campaign against fascist infiltration in the Western Hemisphere. Her work began with fragments, coded messages intercepted by Coast Guard stations, suspicious financial transactions flagged by Treasury investigators, reports from customs officials about unusual travel patterns. Individually, these elements meant nothing. But Elizabeth Friedman possessed the rare ability to see patterns where others saw only noise. The Nazi intelligence networks in South and Central America during the 1930s were not crude operations but rather sophisticated systems built on legitimate business infrastructure. German companies had maintained significant commercial presence in Latin America since the late 19th century, establishing trading firms, manufacturing facilities, and financial institutions throughout the hemisphere. These legitimate enterprises provided perfect cover for intelligence gathering and political organization. Employees of German firms could travel freely, communicate regularly with headquarters in Germany, move money across borders, and build relationships with local political and business leaders without arousing suspicion. The Abwehr, German military intelligence, had recognized the strategic importance of South America long before most American policymakers understood the region's relevance to global security. Control of South American resources, particularly Argentine beef, Chilean copper, and Venezuelan oil, could determine the outcome of any future European conflict. South American ports could provide bases for submarine operations against Atlantic shipping. Political influence in hemispheric governments could neutralize American regional power and create friendly regimes that might provide material support to Germany in the event of war. The Abwehr began building its South American networks in the early 1930s, years before Hitler's aggressive foreign policy made war seem inevitable. Elizabeth Friedman's investigation began in Argentina, where she identified patterns in radio communications that suggested coordination between German business firms and Berlin-based intelligence services. The messages used various cipher systems, some quite sophisticated, but all vulnerable to methodical cryptanalysis. She developed detailed profiles of the networks, who communicated with whom, what information they were gathering, how they moved money, what political connections they were cultivating. She tracked shipments that carried more than commercial goods, financial transfers that exceeded legitimate business needs, travel by individuals whose professional backgrounds did not match their activities. The work was exhausting and isolating. She had no team, no support staff, no colleagues who understood the technical aspects of her analysis. William Friedman was consumed by his army responsibilities, building the signals intelligence infrastructure that would become the National Security Agency. He supported his wife's work, but could offer little practical assistance. Elizabeth worked alone, often late into the night, building cases that no one in authority wanted to pursue, documenting threats that contradicted official narratives about regional security. The State Department, when she approached them with her findings, was politely dismissive. American foreign policy in the 1930s emphasized non-intervention in Latin American affairs, a conscious departure from earlier decades of direct military involvement. State Department officials did not want to hear about German intelligence operations in countries where the United States was trying to build diplomatic relationships based on mutual respect rather than coercion. Military intelligence agencies, focused primarily on Japanese activities in the Pacific, considered South America a low-priority region where German commercial activities posed no immediate threat. The FBI, newly empowered under J. Edgar Hoover's leadership, was primarily concerned with domestic crime and communist infiltration, not foreign intelligence operations in distant countries. But Elizabeth Friedman continued, driven by certainty that her analysis revealed genuine threats that would eventually demand attention. Between 1933 and 1938, she identified and documented 48 separate Nazi intelligence operatives working in 14 South American countries. She mapped communication networks connecting these agents to Abwehr headquarters in Hamburg. She traced financial flows from German government accounts through commercial banks to operatives in Buenos Aires, Rio de Janeiro, Santiago, and Montevideo. She intercepted messages revealing efforts to recruit local political figures, attempts to establish propaganda operations, and plans to create sabotage networks targeting American commercial interests. One network in particular absorbed years of her attention, a sprawling operation centered in Buenos Aires and run by a German businessman named Johannes Siegfried Becker. Becker operated a legitimate import-export firm that traded in textiles and agricultural equipment, but Elizabeth Friedman's analysis of his communications revealed a sophisticated intelligence operation. Becker was coordinating information gathering throughout the Southern Cone, recruiting sources within Argentine military and government circles, establishing secret radio stations for direct communication with Germany, and building financial networks that could support expanded operations if war began. Breaking Becker's communications required developing entirely new cryptanalytic techniques. He used a complex cipher system that combined substitution and transposition with irregular key changes, a methodology that would have defeated conventional analysis. Elizabeth Friedman spent 18 months working on Becker's communications, developing statistical approaches and pattern recognition techniques that were years ahead of standard cryptographic practice. When she finally broke the system in 1936, she had created analytical tools that would later be applied to far more significant intelligence challenges. Her decryption of Becker's network revealed something that alarmed her deeply. The operation was not gathering intelligence in anticipation of possible future conflict, but was instead actively working to create conditions that would favor German interests in an expected war. Becker was coordinating with sympathetic Argentine military officers to plan a coup that would install a pro-German government. He was working with local fascist organizations to spread propaganda and recruit support. He was establishing sabotage networks targeting British and American commercial facilities. The messages made clear that German intelligence viewed war as inevitable and was preparing South American infrastructure to support the Reich's strategic objectives. Elizabeth Friedman compiled a comprehensive report documenting the Becker network, complete with decoded messages, organizational charts, financial documentation, and analysis of the operation's objectives. She submitted it to the State Department, military intelligence, the FBI, and the Coast Guard. The response was bureaucratic paralysis. No single agency wanted to take responsibility for operations in foreign countries. No one wanted to escalate tensions with Germany over activities in regions that seemed peripheral to core American interests. No one wanted to act on intelligence provided by an unofficial consultant with no formal authority. Her report was filed, circulated, discussed, and ultimately ignored. In November 1938, the situation changed. The Nazi regime's increasingly aggressive actions in Europe, the Anschluss with Austria, the Munich Agreement, Kristallnacht finally convinced American policymakers that German expansionism represented a genuine threat to international stability. President Franklin Roosevelt, concerned about Axis influence in the Western Hemisphere, created a new intelligence coordination system and specifically requested information about German activities in Latin America. Suddenly, Elizabeth Friedman's years of marginalized work became urgently relevant. FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover, seizing an opportunity to expand his agency's reach into foreign intelligence operations, requested all available material on Nazi networks in South America. Elizabeth Friedman provided her files, her analyses, her decoded communications, her organizational charts, and her methodological documentation. The FBI, working with Argentine authorities, dismantled the Becker network in a series of raids in early 1939. Johannes Becker was arrested, along with 37 members of his organization. Secret radio stations were discovered and destroyed. Financial accounts were frozen. The operation represented one of the most significant counterintelligence successes of the pre-war period. J. Edgar Hoover held a press conference announcing the successful FBI operation against Nazi spies in Argentina. He described the Bureau's brilliant investigative work, its innovative intelligence techniques, its cooperation with foreign law enforcement. He did not mention Elizabeth Friedman's name. The FBI's public report credited Bureau cryptanalysts with breaking the German codes, a fabrication given that the FBI employed no cryptanalysts in 1939 and had relied entirely on Friedman's work. Newspaper articles praised Hoover's leadership and the FBI's expanding capabilities in counterintelligence operations. Elizabeth Friedman read these accounts from her small Treasury Department office and understood that this would be the pattern. Her work would produce results, men would take credit, and she would return to obscurity to continue building cases that others would claim as their own achievements. But she had also demonstrated something important to herself. The work was not impossible. The threat was real and could be countered. One person, working methodically with the right analytical tools, could make a difference in this shadow war where intelligence and counterintelligence determined outcomes before armies ever engaged. And as Europe moved toward open conflict in 1939, as Germany's strategic ambitions became undeniable, Elizabeth Friedman's warnings about hemispheric security finally received institutional attention. The 23 Networks, a catalogue of infiltration. Between 1939 and 1945, Elizabeth Smith Friedman identified, penetrated, and dismantled 23 separate Nazi intelligence and propaganda networks operating throughout Central and South America. This extraordinary campaign of counter-espionage represented one of the most significant contributions to Allied security during World War II. Yet it remained almost entirely unknown to the public, hidden behind layers of classification that would not be lifted for more than 6 decades. The networks varied enormously in size, sophistication, and objectives, but they shared common characteristics that reflected broader German intelligence strategy in the Western Hemisphere. Each network operated through legitimate business cover, using German commercial firms as fronts for intelligence gathering. Each maintained secret radio communications with Abwehr headquarters in Germany, allowing direct coordination without reliance on diplomatic channels that might be monitored. Each recruited local collaborators, building relationships with sympathetic political figures, business leaders, and military officers who might advance German interests. And each network was vulnerable to cryptanalysis because German intelligence, despite its sophistication in many areas, consistently underestimated Allied code-breaking capabilities. The first network Elizabeth Friedman dismantled after American entry into the war operated in Mexico, where German agents worked to sabotage oil facilities, supplying fuel to the United States military. Mexico had nationalized foreign-owned oil companies in 1938, creating resentment among displaced European business interests and providing opportunities for German intelligence to recruit disgruntled former employees. The network, run by an agent named Georg Nicholas, planned attacks on pipelines, refineries, and port facilities, aiming to disrupt oil shipments to American ports on the Gulf Coast. Friedman intercepted communications between Nicholas and his handlers in Germany, detailing target selection, recruitment of saboteurs, and procurement of explosives. Her decryptions provided specific intelligence that allowed Mexican authorities, working with FBI agents, to arrest Nicholas and 23 members of his network in March 1942 before any attacks occurred. The operation was presented publicly as Mexican detective work, with no mention of signals intelligence or American involvement. Friedman's contribution remained classified. The second network centered in Chile, where German agents worked to influence Chilean government policy and potentially bring Chile into the war on the Axis side. Chile maintained important commercial relationships with Germany, and its large German immigrant community included many Nazi sympathizers. The network, led by a businessman named Ludwig von Bohlen, cultivated relationships with Chilean military officers and right-wing political figures, providing funding for pro-German propaganda and working to block Chile's cooperation with Allied powers. Breaking this network's communications proved particularly challenging because von Bohlen used multiple cipher systems simultaneously, switching between them based on message priority and content. Elizabeth Friedman spent 5 months developing techniques to identify which cipher was being used in any given message and then break it. Her work revealed the full scope of von Bohlen's operations, including payments to Chilean politicians, plans for propaganda campaigns, and efforts to recruit Chilean military personnel to provide intelligence on American naval activities. Chilean authorities, presented with this evidence by American diplomats, arrested von Bohlen and expelled several German diplomats in August 1942. The 3rd through 9th networks operated in Argentina, where German intelligence maintained its most extensive hemispheric presence. Argentina had a large German immigrant population, strong commercial ties to Germany, and a military leadership that admired German martial tradition. Some Argentine officers viewed Germany as a natural ally against British influence in South America. This environment allowed German intelligence to build multiple overlapping networks with different objectives, some focused on intelligence gathering, others on political influence, some on commercial advantage, and several preparing infrastructure for potential sabotage operations. Elizabeth Friedman's work against these Argentine networks required her to develop sophisticated systems for tracking multiple operations simultaneously, distinguishing between networks, and identifying how they coordinated or competed with each other. She built detailed organizational charts showing relationships between agents, financial flows between accounts, and communication patterns that revealed command structures. Her analysis revealed that German intelligence in Argentina was not a unified operation, but rather a collection of sometimes competing organizations: Abwehr military intelligence, Nazi Party intelligence, SS operations, and independent agents working for various German commercial interests. The largest Argentine network, run by an Abwehr officer named Johannes Siegfried Becker, whose pre-war operations Friedman had previously exposed, continued operating even after his initial arrest because German intelligence had compartmentalized the organization. Friedman's wartime work identified 4 separate sub-networks that had survived Becker's removal, each continuing intelligence gathering and political influence operations. She tracked their communications through a complex cipher system that used commercial codebooks as keys, a methodology that should have been nearly unbreakable, but which Friedman defeated through statistical analysis and pattern recognition. Her decryptions revealed that these networks were gathering intelligence on Allied shipping through the South Atlantic, information that was being transmitted to Germany and used to coordinate U-boat operations. The intelligence was sufficiently detailed to suggest that German submarines were receiving real-time updates on convoy movements, allowing them to position themselves for optimal attacks. This discovery had immediate operational importance. If Nazi networks in Argentina were feeding targeting information to U-boats, then dismantling these networks could save Allied shipping and protect the lives of merchant mariners and naval personnel. The 10th network operated in Brazil and was particularly dangerous because it included members of the Brazilian military who were providing intelligence to Germany. Brazil had declared war on Germany in August 1942 after German submarines attacked Brazilian merchant ships, but pro-German sentiment remained strong in some military circles. The network, coordinated by a German expatriate named Karl-Heinz von den Steinen, was transmitting information about Brazilian and American military activities to Abwehr headquarters. Elizabeth Friedman's breakthrough in penetrating this network came when she identified a flaw in their cipher system. They were using a theoretical key that they believed changed daily, but which actually followed a predictable pattern based on dates. Once she recognized this pattern, she could decrypt their entire archive of communications, revealing not just current operations, but months of historical intelligence gathering. The information allowed Brazilian authorities to identify and arrest military officers who had been collaborating with German intelligence, eliminating a significant security breach. Networks 11 through 15 operated in Central American countries, Guatemala, Honduras, El Salvador, Nicaragua, and Costa Rica, where German agents worked through German-owned coffee plantations and export firms. These networks were smaller than the South American operations, but strategically positioned to gather intelligence on American military movements through the Panama Canal. They maintained radio communications with Abwehr stations in Europe and with each other, creating a coordinated surveillance network that monitored Allied activities throughout Central America. Elizabeth Friedman's work against these networks demonstrated her ability to build comprehensive intelligence pictures from fragmentary information. The Central American networks used relatively simple ciphers, but transmitted only brief cryptic messages that were difficult to interpret in isolation. Friedman developed a system for correlating messages across multiple networks, identifying patterns that revealed coordination and reconstructing the larger intelligence picture from these fragments. Her analysis exposed the entire Central American surveillance system, allowing American and local authorities to dismantle all 5 networks in coordinated raids in June 1943. The 16th through 19th networks operated in Colombia, Venezuela, Peru, and Bolivia, focusing primarily on gathering information about American military construction projects and economic development programs. The United States was building air bases, ports, and infrastructure throughout South America as part of hemispheric defense plans, and German intelligence wanted detailed information about these facilities. The networks also monitored American efforts to negotiate oil and mineral contracts, information that might reveal Allied strategic priorities and resource needs. Breaking these networks required Elizabeth Friedman to master multiple cipher systems simultaneously, because each network used different methods tailored to local conditions and communication capabilities. The Colombian network used a sophisticated book cipher based on a German-language edition of Don Quixote. The Venezuelan network employed a transposition cipher with variable length blocks. The Peruvian network used a nomenclator system that assigned code numbers to common phrases. The Bolivian network relied on simple substitution, but changed keys frequently based on a complex schedule. Friedman had to develop specialized techniques for each system, work that required not just cryptographic expertise, but also deep understanding of languages, literature, and communication patterns. The 20th network operated in Ecuador and was focused specifically on monitoring American activities in the Galapagos Islands, where the United States had established a naval base to protect approaches to the Panama Canal. The network, run by a German agent named Heinrich Nöhrler, maintained a clandestine radio station that transmitted detailed intelligence about naval movements, facility construction, and defensive preparations. This intelligence was used by German submarine commanders operating in the Pacific, allowing them to avoid American patrol areas and position themselves to attack shipping routes. Elizabeth Friedman identified the Ecuadorian network's transmissions among hundreds of radio intercepts collected by Coast Guard monitoring stations. She recognized the pattern of a German military cipher she had previously encountered in other South American operations, broke the code, and traced the transmissions to their source near Guayaquil. Her intelligence led to raids that discovered the radio station, arrested Noehler and his operatives, and eliminated a significant source of intelligence for German Pacific operations. The 21st and 22nd networks operated in Uruguay and Paraguay, both working to facilitate movement of Nazi agents and materials through South America. Uruguay's network, centered in Montevideo, provided false documentation, financial services, and communication facilities for German intelligence personnel moving through the region. Paraguay's network focused on smuggling, moving money, equipment, and potentially people across borders using established contraband routes developed during Prohibition enforcement years. These networks were particularly difficult to penetrate because they operated more like criminal organizations than traditional intelligence services. They used codes and ciphers common among smuggling operations rather than military systems, making their communications harder to identify among the volume of criminal traffic that Elizabeth Friedman monitored. Breaking them required applying techniques she had developed years earlier during Prohibition enforcement, demonstrating how her seemingly peripheral early work had prepared her for more significant challenges.